2006, I went to a thing just like this, science lecture at MIT. I saw one of the leading autism researchers present his then new, eye tracking data on autism, which showed that autistic people look at mouths more than eyes when we look at people's faces. His explanation for this was that we're drawn to mouths because mouths are moving and therefore they're more interesting. And then he moved on, but I could not let him move on. So I raised my hand, which all of you know is wildly inappropriate. Please don't do that right now. And he, a bit confused, was like, yes? And I said, listen, autistic people aren't drawn to mouths, we're drawn away from eyes because eye contact is painful and unpleasant for us a lot of the time. And he said, how do you know this? And I said, well, because I'm autistic and so are all the kids that I work with. And he explained confirmation bias and I sat down. Several years later, I saw one of his colleagues present exactly the same research, except he included the fact that eye contact is aversive in his explanation of the results. So it took a few years, but science did finally catch up to something I already knew. The question I want you to think about today is, should he have listened to me? So, as Susanna mentioned, I'm in Asperger's or Us. 9 years ago, me and several other guys, also with Asperger's, started this comedy troupe to do comedy for Aspies. And before our second show ever, we were rehearsing in my apartment. And we heard a knock on the door. I wasn't expecting anyone, so I opened the door, and it was the police. I said, yes. He said, we heard something about someone getting beaten and robbed. And it was at that moment that I realized we needed to close the windows when we rehearsed the 911 sketch. Because one of my neighbors had heard us yell, help, I'm being beaten and robbed, and very kindly called the police. Luckily for us, the cops said, weren't you in the paper yesterday? Because our first ever article had just come out. The first time we ever got recognized as famous comedians was by the police coming to my apartment. The cops left, and a lot of neurotypicals would have been able to move on and said, oh, that was funny, let's go back to rehearsal. But I knew, despite the fact that none of us mentioned it, all four of us would not be able to move on and keep rehearsing because our arousal level would be too high from this confrontation with a potential authority figure. And so we had to end rehearsal. And this was a moment where none of us talked about it, but it became very clear very quickly. We're all thinking about what just happened. That could have gone so much worse. That was horrible. I didn't want to have to deal with that confrontation. That makes me so nervous. And none of us expressed it at all. But I knew it was true, and so we ended rehearsal. Later we talked about this. Because one of the core things that autistic people are most afraid of is conflict. You don't hear this in the literature. And the reason you don't hear this in the literature is because researchers aren't asking autistic people what's going through their heads very often. But we know this. Unfortunately, if you do ask autistic people, are you afraid of conflict? Conflict-averse people will often pretend they're not, because they want this potentially conflict-driven situation to end. 8 years later, Asperger's or Us is doing our 150th show in Baltimore this summer. Our Q&As often have a lot of autistic people who come and ask us questions. We perform in 10 countries, most US states. We've talked to thousands of autistic people around the world. And we've learned a lot from being in the troupe together. And during the Q&A, this often happens, but this time in particular, I remember I said something that I had never thought of before until I said it, and then I realized, ooh, I'm onto something. Which which is that autistic people's biggest fear is being reminded that we have a physical perspective, a physical presence in the world that goes beyond just having a perspective. As I said this, all the autistic people in the crowd were like, yeah. And even New Michael, who's in the troop with me, who rarely agrees with me on anything publicly, said, I think you hit the nail on the head on that one. We don't want to be reminded that we are anything more than just a perspective. One of the reasons I know this, aside from obviously being autistic for my whole life, is the many reports that autistic people write on the internet, the stories they tell. The fact that we don't like being called by our given names and often make up a pseudonym instead of being called by our given name, and use that pseudonym until we begin to associate it with a human being, as opposed to just an abstract idea, at which point we will change from one pseudonym to another. This is something I've never seen reported in the literature. But autistic people have talked about, yeah, I don't like being called by my given name. I'd rather be called by some, vague pronoun or just, that person or something like this. This is why we feel eye contact is aversive. Because if you're looking into my eyes, I have to understand you're looking at something, and that something is me. And this is reminding me I exist on this planet and am not just watching TV right now, which is very unappealing if your goal is to not be reminded that you have a physical presence on Earth. Thank you. Another thing I've never seen in the literature is that as pedestrians, we don't look at drivers of cars who stop and wait for us to cross. We look at the car, because it's not about the eyes, it's about the fact that you're reacting to me as an individual. So this makes crossing the street harder, because I get zero information from the driver, whether they're saying come on or stop. I go based entirely on, does it make sense to go right now? These are things I've learned from talking to autistic people, being an autistic person. These are stories that have been very valuable to me to understand how this stuff works. You may not have access to a whole lot of autistic people to talk to all the time, and of course I can forgive this. But what you can do, if you're interested, is look up what autistic people have written on the internet. There's a hashtag on Twitter called Asking Autistics, where autistic people will answer questions and tell stories. I looked at this a couple weeks ago before I got here, and I discovered a couple things I'd never thought of. One of them is that a whole lot of us, despite the fact that I already knew we have hypersensitivity to noise, I'd never thought about the kind of noise that we're hypersensitive to. This beeping that was happening earlier, which was the timer for the presenters, was driving me crazy, and I almost had to leave the room. But things like fans or white noise machines are very soothing to us, and perhaps even more so than they are to neurotypicals who also benefit from these things. This is something I discovered from reading Asking Autistics. Another one that I discovered from reading Asking Autistics is the fact that a lot of us barely age. Would you believe Temple Grandin is 72? Would you believe I'm exactly half that? This is something I've dealt with for a long time. So I've asked myself the question, which was based on what this Asking Autistics hashtag taught me. Do we change more slowly because our cells don't change as quickly? Do they not age as quickly? And this is why we have hypersensitivity to change. I don't know enough about neuroscience to figure this out, but I bet some people here might. I don't know how cell change works, but I do know that this does seem to be a real thing. Speaking of hypersensitivity to change, procrastinate a lot. This is a big issue with a lot of the clients I've worked with over the years who are really smart and capable, but you say, go get a job this week, and in a week they have done nothing. And people are confused about this, and something I read on Asking Autistics taught me perhaps the answer is that we have trouble dealing with change. So when there's a new thing presented, we have to mentally get ready to do this thing. And if we don't spend several hours thinking about this beforehand, like not thinking about it in a fearful way, but like, okay, at this time I will do this, we aren't ready, we can't do it. And if we never do that during the week, it never happens. These are all, again, things I learned from just a very cursory examination of the hashtag Asking Autistics. So this brings me back to my initial question about should that professor have listened to me 13 years ago. There's a lot of value in listening to people tell stories about themselves, as we've heard all day. You learned about perhaps damage to the temporal lobe can help us understand how to appreciate beauty from this story. I don't know if we've tested that, but that's enough for me to say this is worth looking into. It's my opinion that if you're doing any research on humans and their experience, you can ask these people, or if you don't have anyone to ask, look it up. As you're doing your hypothesis, your method design, your research interpretations, what do all the autistic people think of the eye contact research? Do they agree that it is aversive, generally speaking? Do they agree that it feels very abusive to force? Look it up. If you're smart, you can use the scientific method to say, all right, I got 300 autistic people saying one thing and no one in science saying this. I'm going to go with the autistic people on this one. But after I said that thing at that conference at MIT, one of my autistic idols at the time wrote about how cool it was that this autistic guy stood up and vouched for us, and it felt really good. The person who wrote this about me was someone I really looked up to. But after a few years of figuring this stuff out a little bit more, I realized I didn't need to. Because this was a person who fell victim to a self-fulfilling prophecy of autism. I know this because I did the same thing, not to the same degree. But so this person went to college and dated people and went out and did things socially, but after getting an autism diagnosis, changed and began to stop speaking or even walking without the assistance of a wheelchair, despite being able to write very well online. And I realized this is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just because a lot of other autistic people do this doesn't mean I have to. And I had fallen victim to this too. My mom, who's here by the way, would point out things like, you never did this before you got this diagnosis, why are you doing it now? And at the time I did not understand that I was falling victim to a self-fulfilling prophecy and behaving in a more autistic way than I naturally would. Autistic people fall victim to self-fulfilling prophecies and confirmation bias and self-serving bias, maybe even more than neurotypicals do. I don't know. I know it happens though. So if you're interested in this stuff, and you find someone who's writing about this very passionately, check around, talk to this person, see if this person can add to your research. Or if there are a bunch of other autistic people saying, no, we don't feel that way, well, you know how to do science. I would love it if we could include autistic people in every experiment on autism. But I know that that is not practically feasible for a lot of you and would slow down research a lot. So I'll say nothing about us without us, but at the very least, read the stuff that people you're writing about and doing experiments on have to say. And maybe hire some of them to help you with your work. I'll be here until about 5. Feel free to come and talk to me if you have anything you want me to give you input and I would love to hear what you all have to say about this. Thank you.